Hi guys, I'm going to start with who was Roald Dahl. I've never read this biography, and he is my favorite children's author other than Dr. Seuss, and I would like to learn more about him. If the vote comes out that you guys want Charlie and the Chocolate Factory too, you guys may just be lucky and get 2 recordings of me reading. So a biography is when it's written by somebody else. So it's not written by Roald Dahl, but it is the true story of his life. So, here's the contents. Let's look. In 1940, during World War II, Roald Dahl was a fighter pilot in the British Royal Air Force. He had to fly a biplane to a secret airstrip in Africa, accompanied by a pilot in the second plane. Roald was nervous about finding the airstrip. That's what planes looked like back then, by the way. It was hidden and could be hard to spot. It was also very near enemy lines. When they took off, it was already getting dark. Roald figured the airstrip was about 50 minutes away, but after about an hour, there was still no airstrip in sight, just empty desert, rocks, and boulders. Roald circled the area desperately. Had he been given the wrong directions? He was low on gas. It was growing darker. He had to do an emergency landing. He had to take a chance. The plane crashed. Roald's nose was smashed, his skull was fractured, and he was knocked out. The plane burst into flames. The pilot in the second plane managed to land safely and rescue Roald. It took a long time for Roald to get better. Did he go back home? No. He still wanted to be a fighter pilot. By the time World War II ended in 1945, he had shot down 5 enemy planes. His war adventures in far-off Africa made good stories. Roald started writing about them for magazines. Today, however, Roald Dahl is not world famous for being a war hero or a magazine writer. Millions of people know him because of the amazing books he wrote for children. In a tiny hut near his house in the English countryside, he wrote such classics as Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, Matilda, the BFG, and Fantastic Mr. Fox. Roald Dahl was imaginative and funny. He invented words like buzzwangle, zip-fizzing, and frobscottle, and creatures like Oompa Loompas and Snozzwangers. He remembered what it was like to be a child, and he knew what children liked to read. Roald Dahl is remembered as one of the greatest storytellers of our time. So that was like the little preface about the author, about Roald Dahl. So now let's see what he was like when he was young. Roald Dahl was born September 13th, 1916 in Wales. Wales borders England and it is part of Great Britain. His parents, Sophie and Harold, were from Norway. They named him Roald after a famous Norwegian explorer, Roald Amundsen, who reached the South Pole in 1911. I just want to go back real quick. So here's Great Britain, which is now we call it England, and Wales is this little country off the side of it. And then you have Norway up there, and like you guys are familiar where Europe is when you look at the continent, so it's over there. It's in Europe. So the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, who reached the South Pole in 1911. So that means he went to Antarctica in 1911. That was a really long time ago. Harold's job was to provide ships in Wales with coal and supplies. He got quite rich doing it. As a young man, Harold had lost his arms in an accident. Much later, Roald thought it was amazing that his father could tie his shoes faster using only one hand than Roald could with 2. Oh, he had lost his arm, just one arm. Okay, sorry guys. That's why you have to pay attention to the little words. So he had lost his arm in the accident, and then Roald thought it was amazing that his dad could tie his shoelaces with one hand faster than he could tie it with 2 when he was a young boy. That's a cool fact. So Sophie was Harold's second wife. His first wife died very young. Sophie was smart and well educated. Like Harold, she loved beautiful things. She and Harold had 3 daughters, Astrid, Alfred, Alfhild, and Else, and 1 son, Roald. Being the only boy, Roald's sisters called him the Apple. That was short for the apple of his mother's eye, which meant that Roald was her favorite. His mother was a great storyteller. She told the children stories about Norwegian monsters, trolls, and fairies. Roald certainly inherited a lot from her. It means he got a lot from his mom. So here's the picture. And if you guys are reading along, because I think most of you can with this book. So when Roald was 2, his family moved to a mansion in a small village in Wales. A mansion is like a huge house. They spoke English, but also spoke Norwegian at home. The Dahls were a close, happy family. When Roald was only about 3 years old, his life was shattered. His 7-year-old sister, Astrid, died of appendicitis. A few months later, his broken-hearted father also died. Sophie was left to care for her 3 children. She was also raising 2 stepchildren from Harold's first marriage. And on top of that, she was expecting another child. She had to manage the big house, grounds, servants, farmers, and gardeners. Roald's mother was practical and brave. After baby Asta was born, she moved the family to a smaller house in town. Roald later said his mother was a rock, a real rock, always on your side, whatever you'd done. It sounds like he still came from a good family, but had some hardship when he was young. I'm going to read a couple chapters at a time so that we know that we have time to get through it, okay, guys? So, Chapter 2, School Days. When Roald was 6 years old, he started kindergarten. During his school years, he sometimes did something that put his mother to the test. He and his sister rode their tricycles to school, racing down a steep hill and around a corner, so fast they were riding on only 2 wheels. And you know, a tricycle has 3 wheels. It sounds dangerous, but at least there was little traffic in those days. After kindergarten, Roald went to a school for boys. He certainly wasn't the best student. Roald was especially bad at spelling. Even so, he liked to write. He started keeping a secret diary at home when he was 8. He kept it hidden from his 4 nosy sisters in a tin box high in a tree. Roald would sit way up on the branch and write. It's a pretty cool thing to know about him. Roald didn't like school. What he did like was stopping by the candy shop with his friends on the way home. The candy shop was run by a crabby old woman, Mrs. Pratchett. She dug candy out of the jars for boys with her dirty hands. Yuck. In today's day and age, we really need to wash our hands because of everything going on, so that is really kind of gross back then, huh? The boys ate the candy anyway, of course, but to get back at her, they snuck a dead mouse into one of the jars. The next day, oh my gosh, if I found a dead mouse in a jar of candy, I would so scream. How about you guys? So the next day, Mrs. Pratchett came to their school. She pointed out the 5 boys she suspected. Right in front of Mrs. Pratchett, the teacher took a cane and hit each boy hard on the rear end several times. A cane could leave an ugly welt or scar. Back then, that's how they disciplined, even in school. So when Roald's mother heard about it, she got really mad. She wasn't mad about the boys' prank. She was mad about the caning. So mad that she sent Roald to a different school the next year. It was a boarding school for boys called St. Peter's Preparatory School. Roald was only 9, and he was terribly homesick. Do you guys remember when we talked about the different types of schools? I forget. I think it was Schools Across the World in the Journeys text, and we learned about boarding school. That's where you go and you sleep at school. You live at school with the teachers, and you live far away from your parents. So he's being sent to a boarding school. That's why he's so homesick. The head of the school was mean. The boys were hit with a cane, for breaking any rules. At night, Roald slept facing toward home and quietly cried himself to sleep. He wrote his mother every week. It became a habit he continued until she died about 40 years later. 40 years is a long time from there, so at least he had his mom most of his life. Roald wanted to go home so badly he faked having appendicitis. This was what his sister had died of. He was sent home, but the doctor there knew Roald was pretending. Back he went to school. Oh, he didn't get away with that. At Christmas, there was a happy surprise at home. His father had a new motor car, or his family had a new motor car. No one knew how to drive it, but his 21-year-old half-sister bravely took the whole family out for a ride. They crashed. Roald's nose was almost knocked off and hung on only by a thread. Ah, can you imagine? But fortunately, the doctor was able to stitch it back on. And back then, the doctors and technology was not all that great yet, so he's really lucky they were able to sew that back on. Every summer, the Dahls went to an island in Norway for vacation. In those days, it was hard to get there. The whole group, 10 altogether, had to take taxis, trains, boats, and ferries. Ferries are a type of boat. It took 4 days, but what a wonderful place. There's the big picture. Their mother took them on adventures to islands and fishing in a small motorboat. They called it the Hard Black Stinker. Fearless Sophie could handle the boat even in big waves. In 1927, the Dahl family moved to Bexley, near London. Their new house had a tennis court and gardens. The new neighbors, there's all the adventures one more time. The new neighbors did not think Mrs. Dahl was a proper parent. She let her kids run wild and use bad language. They thought that she was not nearly strict enough. When Roald was 13, he left his family and his pet mice, Montague and Marmaduke, to go to another boarding school. It was called Repton School. In many ways, Repton was even worse than St. Peter's. I'm just going to take a minute to show you guys the picture. So there's the little pet mice, and there's the whole picture of the tennis court at their new house in Bexley. Now these are drawings, but they are supposed to be pretty realistic because this is a biography, so it's a true story about Roald Dahl. So there were more rules and more canings. This was not a nice place. Not only the teachers, but also the older boys were allowed to beat the younger boys. It was lonely and frightening for Roald. At least Roald was good at sports: hockey, soccer, cricket, squash, and swimming. It helped that he was almost 6 feet 6 inches tall. Wow, that's tall. In his last year at Repton, he won the school boxing match. His teachers did not think much of him. One wrote that he did not like the way Roald so persistently wrote words meaning the exact opposite of what he obviously intended. Certainly, his teacher never expected Roald to become a great writer. Was there anything Roald liked about Repton? Yes, it was in the town where the Cadbury chocolate was made. The Cadbury Company, do you guys know the Cadbury eggs around Easter time? So the Cadbury Company often asked students to rate their chocolate bars. The boys took their duties very seriously. Roald always loved chocolate. There was the germ of an idea for a great book there, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. At Repton, Roald took up photography. That's when you take pictures. See him with the camera? He spent hours in the dark room and he won prizes for his photos. The dark room is where you develop the pictures from the film. Roald also found other ways to escape the terrors of Repton. Sometimes he took long walks. Then he bought a motorcycle and hid it in a garage a few miles from school. On Sundays, he raced about the countryside, wearing a hat, scarf, and goggles. He was hoping to disguise himself. If he had been caught, he would have been kicked out of school. So he was a risk taker. By July 1933, Roald Dahl was more than ready to leave school. He had had enough. Unlike most of his classmates, though, he did not go on to college. He wanted to see the world. So tomorrow we will read chapter 3, Adventures. I hope you're enjoying getting to know about Roald Dahl. I certainly am. Bye, guys.